Why is Arthur versus Dragon the best fight ever? Usually fights have all kinds of lore or backstories, but Arthur and Dragon are just two dudes. I mean, they just met and had instant beef with each other, and yet their rivalry led to what is commonly argued to be the best fight in manga. So the real question is, how do you take two random characters and use them to write one of the best fights in manga? That's why in this video, I'd like to discuss the common factor in all of the best matchups, examine how this is applied to the rivalry between Fire Force's scariest character and its dumbest character, and explain why Arthur vs. Dragon will completely break the internet. Just be warned that this may contain some spoilers for Season 3. Now, the first question we should be asking is, why are matchups such a big deal? I mean, a fight is a fight, and people like fights. So you should be able to make a great fight with any two random characters, right? Well, that's kind of true, but as I'm sure you know, not all fights are made equal. Every great fight needs a great story. That's what makes the difference between an epic battle and two dudes doing a whole bunch of nothing. And a lot of that story is decided before the fight even starts. Because if you want to get people invested in the fight, you need to hype up the matchup. And while there's a ton of ways to do this, it really comes down to 4 basic stories. There's good versus evil, which you've seen a million times. Family is another big one, since we all know family drama is the best kind of drama. Then there's the strongest versus the strongest, or what I would call a title fight. And then the last one is just foils. And this is where Arthur versus Dragon would fall under. Now, we all know what a foil is. It's a character that contrasts another character in an effort to highlight or build up that main character. That's a pretty broad definition, but that's because it can kind of cover anything. In some cases, it can get pretty deep, like the battle of science versus power in Dr. Stone, or the battle of philosophies in Psycho-Pass. But it can also be as simple as light versus dark, order versus chaos, one element versus another element, and in the case of Arthur versus Dragon, it's about as simple as you can get. The two characters have never met before. They're not family. They are both strong, but they're not exactly the two strongest characters in Fire Force. They're both kinda dumb, so a philosophical battle is out of the question. The only reason these two have any beef with each other is because Dragon's whole identity is that he's Dragon and he destroys everything, and Arthur is the Night King. And what do knights do when they're not saving princesses? They kill dragons. It sounds like the dumbest fight because you have two honestly dumb characters, and their only beef is that one of them's a dragon, sort of, and the other wants to be a knight. But Dragon is the perfect foil for Arthur, not just because he's a dragon, but also because, like Arthur, his power comes from his ability to manifest his identity. And it's from this relationship between the two characters that Ohkubo builds one of the story's best written fights. But real quick, before I say more on that, make sure to become a channel member if you're enjoying the video. You get exclusive badges and emojis that you can use during our weekly live streams, and you can pick which series I cover next. Now, like I was saying, part of the fun of this matchup is that it's a classic rivalry, knights versus dragons. But Ohkubo doesn't just throw these characters in the ring and expect us to care about it. Like any good fight, Ohkubo creates a good story. And he starts that story by slowly building tension. It starts in the beginning of Obi's rescue arc. Company 8 is traveling underground and Arthur comes across a little tiny lizard. Arthur, being Arthur, immediately associates lizards with dragons and goes on about how it's the goal of every knight to become a dragon slayer, and so he wants to find a dragon he can fight. Later in the same chapter, we see the destroyers talking about how strong Assault is, how he was strong enough to be one of the destroyers. But then someone joins in, implies that they're on a completely different level than the other destroyers, and asks them, who do you think the title Destroyer refers to? And that's when we get the reveal for the White Clad's strongest soldier. His name? Dragon the Destroyer. Seeing as how Arthur is on his way to fight the White Clads and desperately wants to fight a dragon, and the strongest White Clad is named Dragon and is waiting for Company 8, everyone who reads this chapter has an oh shit moment. Like, oh, wait a minute, is this what I think it is? These two characters haven't even met yet. They don't even have any reason to know about each other. And in just one chapter, Ohkubo has us at the edge of our seat, dying to see these two characters meet. This brings us to chapter 186, where Ohkubo continues to build that hype. Arthur shows up, stops stream with one attack, and saves the day. But before he can even gloat, a voice comes up from above, the ground below tremors, and Dragon introduces himself as he falls before Arthur. Dragon threatens to turn Arthur into dust, but Arthur is glowing with excitement now that he's finally found his dragon. And this is the next oh shit moment. This is when you realize that this is going to be one of the biggest battles of aura farming you've ever seen. And if we're being honest, that's kind of what this boils down to. Like, I might sit here and talk about the genius of Ohkubo's writing or the brilliance of this matchup, but between us girls.
Yeah, between us girls.
A lot of the fun is Dragon and Arthur taking turns aura farming. But that's the point, because now we have our story. We've known for almost 200 chapters that Arthur is a knight. That's just his thing. And as we can clearly see, Dragon loves to tell people that his name is Dragon. So we're invested in this fight, one, because it's a classic knight versus dragon thing, and two, because this is clearly going to be an epic fight between two of the biggest meatheads in Fire Force. And that's exactly what we get. Dragon starts the fight by literally breathing fire. Then as the smoke clears, all you see is Dragon in blind fury with his teeth showing like big fangs. You can practically hear the guy roaring. This builds on Dragon's whole dragon aesthetic because now he's acting even more like a dragon. In turn, this builds up the tension because this dragon versus knight thing is getting more and more real. Arthur responds with a violet flash that splits the building behind them completely in half, but it doesn't do any damage. At this point, Arthur and Dragon are just dancing, exchanging blows while figuring out how the other fights and what they're capable of. Arthur teases Dragon for implying he's not human, but Dragon says that he is Dragon. Arthur responds by saying he's a knight and even starts to roleplay. Then as the fight continues, Dragon smirks as he suggests that Arthur should mix in some counterattacks. He smiles and commends Arthur's skills, claiming that he should be considered a master. And this is pretty much the pace of most of the fight. Now that the two characters are well acquainted, they continue this dance where they know the other person is strong, but they want to see just how far they can go. This is what we see as Dragon slowly reveals one strong ability after another, and Arthur responds by powering up his Excalibur and using a brand new mantle ability. Dragon gives Arthur credit for his skills, and Arthur admits that Dragon is clearly stronger than anyone he's ever met. At this point, we've moved on from simple hype and now we've started to witness the story of this rivalry, namely the struggle to see just how strong each character is. But Ohkubo throws in a shocking twist when he reveals Dragon's ability, Dragon Scale, basically admitting that he's a crazy strong infernal. This brings the fight closer to its climax, as now Dragon is able to overwhelm Arthur with his Dragon Scale and his infernal attack that sends Arthur flying with barely any effort. Fortunately, this only pushes Arthur to fight even harder, powering up Excalibur into the massive dragon-killing Holy Sword. But then at the climax of the fight when Arthur attacks, Dragon takes Excalibur head on and literally shatters the sword. As a result, Arthur is left a mess, but Dragon is left free to rampage against everyone without so much as a scratch. Which brings us to the tragic conclusion of the fight. Arthur, who has never lost a fight up until this point, is completely and utterly defeated. He wanted to beat a dragon, and when he found his dragon, he was completely outclassed. Meanwhile, this dragon is probably the strongest member of the Whiteclads. And this is the story we're left with. Dragon is the perfect foil for Arthur, not just because Arthur's a knight and he's a dragon, but also because they're both two characters that live in the realm of fantasy, to the point where they almost seem like Don Quixote tilting at Mills. Except, instead of LARPing and making everyone feel awkward, they just blow everything up. Now, on the one hand, this resolves itself in a fairly disappointing defeat. We wanted to see an epic fight between Arthur and his ultimate enemy. Instead, we got a fight that only really lasted a few chapters and ended with Arthur getting embarrassed. But the beauty of it is that this isn't supposed to be a real fight. This is supposed to be the promo, the prologue to an even better fight. Kind of like in the Rocky movies when Rocky would see how scary the bad guy was, then he would go on a super cool 80s training montage before he fought the guy at the end of the movie. That's basically what happens to Arthur. Defeated and without his signature Excalibur, Arthur reaches an all-time low. But this sets him up to go on what can only be described as the greatest quest in all of literature. A quest to face his past, forge an even greater sword worthy of his title, and reclaim his glory as the Night King. So really, this fight does two things. First, it hypes up the matchup between Arthur and Dragon. It's still incredible to think that Ohkubo took two characters that had never met before and instantly turned them into the greatest rivals in manga. But then on top of that, he uses it to crush Arthur only so that he can be built back up into one of the greatest characters he's ever written. As a result, we get even more tension that gets us to wait for what can only be described as one of the all-time best fights in the universe. And that's how you write a great matchup. It doesn't always have to be a psychological battle of minds. Sometimes all it really takes is two meatheads and a battle for destiny. But what do you think? How would you describe this matchup? What do you think makes a good matchup? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You get exclusive badges and emojis, you can pick which series I cover next, and you can even get credited in future videos. Also check out my other Fire Force videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.